If you didn't hear that, you can feel free to submit questions from your phone. Okay, thanks so much, David. And Megan, I'm pleased to be here today. I'm going to talk about how meshes come to market. Here are my disclosures, and they're not directly relevant to my topics for today. So about 7 years ago, a lady approached me. She was a patient, and she was having abdominal pain. She had had a ventral hernia repair a year or two before and had a lump that developed after that, and her surgeon had told her numerous times that it would go away. But now she was going to become a candidate for a lung transplant, and her lung transplant surgeon would not transplant her until we addressed the issue with the lump. So after getting a CT scan, I found a chronic seroma that she had and offered her a resection of the chronic seroma, and she also asked me to take her mesh out, and I told her I'd be pleased to do that. In preparation for the case, of course, I got her old operative report and found this was the device that was used for this patient. So I think we all know where this is going, and we've all seen this before, and I think we all know the end point with what happened with PhysioMesh. So about a year after she approached me, PhysioMesh was recalled from the market. And the purpose of the recall was that after laparoscopic ventral hernia repair, the rates of recurrences of ventral hernia went up. But in that recall, they actually quoted 2 studies from hernia registries. One was the Hernia Med Registry, and the other one was the Danish Hernia Registry. And here are those 2 studies. So those were published later in 2018 and 2020, but it was the data from those that ultimately was used to pull the device from the market. Now, what is interesting about this is that most people don't know that about a year prior to that event, there was a prospective randomized controlled trial that was ongoing, comparing PhysioMesh with Secure Strap and Ventralite ST with Sorbifix. So there were meant to be 50 patients in each arm of that trial, and they were going to look at pain measured by the visual analog scale as the primary outcome for that operation. Before the trial could be concluded, it was discontinued prematurely at 25 patients in each arm, and the reason for the discontinuation of the trial was that there was a 20% recurrence rate in PhysioMesh patients. So 5 out of 25 of those patients had a recurrence within 6 months of the device being placed, where there were 0 in the other arm, and then the other thing that they found was an significantly increased rate of pain in the PhysioMesh patients. So it begs the question, if you get that signal, why is the device not being removed from the market sooner? And I want to dip into that just a little bit. So how did we get here? The mesh, PhysioMesh, went to market in 2010. And the study that I mentioned was published in 2015, but the voluntary market withdrawal of that device did not occur until 14 months later. During that time, presumably thousands of meshes were implanted into patients, and complications are likely still going to be forthcoming because this is a permanent device. And as one of our prior speakers mentioned in the last session, lawsuits are currently underway and about to be settled. But this isn't a new story. We've seen this time and time again when it comes to medical devices. And many of you probably are familiar with Kugel Composites Mesh, which was withdrawn from the market, I think maybe around 2013 or so. But it's not even just with hernia mesh devices. It's in devices with all kinds of different fields. So we all know quite well about what happened with transvaginal mesh, and then you may or may not be aware that ASR hip joints were similar. Those were metal-on-metal hip joints that were causing metallosis or subsequent malignancies or early failure of hip replacements. And both of those devices were pulled from the market or changed for their indication for use based on registry data. So in order to understand how we could have gotten this far down this trail and be in so much trouble, you have to understand a little bit about the FDA and how that came into being. So, when you start in surgical residency, you probably think that the FDA has been around forever, like gravity, but that's not true. It didn't exist ever until 1906, and the reason that it came into being is that there was a lot of adulterated or mislabeled food products that were hitting the market at that time. So Congress felt that in order to protect consumers, there needed to be a regulatory body. By 1917, the FDA identified that there was a need to regulate devices coming to market because they were seeing all kinds of fraudulent devices flooding the market. But due to multiple kind of issues that occurred between then and 1976, even though medical device regulation was brought up numerous times, It didn't actually occur until 1976. And I'm going to talk more about that in just a second. But the Medical Device Regulation Act in 1976 was the first time that the United States federal government said, okay, we have to regulate these devices when they come to market. After that, in 1990, so it was 14 years before the FDA could even then call for a recall of any device that hit the market. And so I want to talk about the Medical Device Regulation Act. So again, in 1976, and I will tell you that this is still the device regulation that we use today. So this rule was made up a long time ago. And so that Device Regulation Act said that essentially all devices hitting the market have to be classified into one of three classifications. Class 1 requires no pre-market approval or clearance, but must follow control. So this is like dental floss or a toothpick or something that's not going to cause harm if it fails. Class 2, which is 510K, that is pre-market notification. So devices that come to market after Class 2, 510K clearance, essentially are any device that looks like a predicate device, so are of substantial equivalence to a prior device, can come to the market, and I'm going to talk about that more in just a second. But the difference between that and Class 3 is that Class 3 devices are pre-market approval devices. So those types of devices are the ones that if they fail, a patient might die or have substantial morbidity. They're devices that are permanent or necessary to sustain life. And so to bring something to market that's Class 3, it requires a lot of stringent studies, expensive clinical trials, post-market surveillance. These are all requirements. So when making this legislation, Congress was weighing two competing goals that everybody should know about. One is that we need to be able to provide the public with assurances that they're getting reasonable and safe devices placed into them. But the other one is that we have to avoid over-regulating the industry and thereby stifling innovation. When we talk about Class 2 devices, that is how meshes are cleared, we have to have some perspective for the overall legislation. So first of all, this legislation came into being in 1976, as I mentioned. And the reason that it came about is that there was an intrauterine device that was causing infections in women and causing subsequent severe sepsis and mortality. So that's why Congress was finally pushed to make a move to do something. But also we have to understand this from the context that in 1976, there were relatively few devices even on the market. So this wasn't an unreasonable way to try to adjudicate which ones could come to market in which way. And 510K at that time, importantly, was specifically intended for simple devices like surgical gloves or hearing aids. So what does 510K mean? First of all, a 510K device is cleared. It is not approved by the FDA. Those are two different things. Second of all, with pre-market notification, companies have to tell the FDA within 90 days that they're intending to bring this device to market. That gives the FDA enough time to review evidence that this device is substantially equivalent to a device that came before it prior to May 28th, 1976. And substantial equivalence is defined by similarity to a predicate device, either by design, material, chemical composition, energy source, manufacturing process, or intended use. So if you meet any of those categories, that counts as substantial equivalence. And so the indication for use for every single hernia device that hits the market today remains to reinforce soft tissues where weakness exists. So there are obviously some big shortcomings with this Class 2 designation. One is that it does not require clinical trials. So the meshes coming to market today have not undergone, in many cases, prospective trials with patients involved. They don't require pre-market inspections of how the device was manufactured. So the FDA is not going to the industry to see how their meshes are made. Post-market surveillance is not required. So once that device goes out, the FDA has no legitimate way to tell you how that device is behaving in the hernia mesh ecosystem. And finally, the FDA has very little authority to withdraw clearance if a device is found to be unsafe. This is a little bit of a busy slide, but I'm going to tell you why the substantial equivalency matters so much. So this slide is a study that was published in PLOS One in 2018, and they were looking at Merceline mesh as a predicate device that hit the market, I think, around 1976. So this is a multi-filament polyester mesh, I think by Ethicon, that hit the market in 1976. And then all the little black dots are the descendants of that mesh. But you can see over to screen left, there are two red dots. And those are two devices that were predicate devices, or that were, descendant devices from Merceline mesh that were recalled from the market. So why do we care? If you look across the rest of that little chart, you can see 12 little yellow bubbles, and those are descendant devices that came from those two withdrawn devices. So what that means is all 12 of those that are descendants of those two withdrawn devices can now have their own mesh babies that may not be like that device, may not be like the device before it, but might be substantially equivalent to the device before that. So you can see how much trouble we're in. So why don't we do device surveillance? Well, we have the FDA MAUDE database, which is a database that exists through the FDA. It's on the FDA website. Reporting for it is voluntary. And so what that means is that there is an absent denominator. So we don't actually know how many devices are going into patients to begin with. And then there's also an absent numerator, meaning that we don't understand the number of events. In fact, the number of events reported to it, the rate is thought to be about 0.5% of all medical device failures might be reported to the MAUDE database. The MAUDE database is also reliant on manufacturers to report, but you can see the obvious conflict of interest there. And then finally, surgeon reporting is burdensome and opaque. Most surgeons don't even know that this exists, don't know how to turn in a submission of a complaint. There are field safety representatives that exist from all of our industry partners that will show up in the operating room, but they do have some discretion as to what they report and what they do not through the MAUDE database. And finally, there can be direct reporting through the website, and as I mentioned, most surgeons aren't even aware of that. Also importantly, the FDA is required to make publicly available the evidence that these devices have shown substantial equivalence to the public. So you should be able to look up any device that was cleared through the 510K process and find the publicly available evidence that exists, that it's a substantial equivalence to a prior device. In this study published in JAMA Internal Medicine in 2014, they basically did a sample of devices cleared through the 510K process and found that only 16% of those devices have publicly available data to support their substantial equivalence. So why not designate mesh as class 3? Well, first of all, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry, so it's very difficult to move the levers to get that to happen. It would require expensive randomized control trials and clinical trials. Lobbyists argue heavily against the stifling of innovation, and confusion benefits our industry stakeholders, right? Because the ability to bring any device to market is key to the mesh industry. The Center for Device and Regulation Committee is basically the FDA committee that clears all these devices, is completely inundated. They have thousands of devices coming through every single year, and only 1% of them are approved through the class 3 process. It would literally take an act of Congress to get there. All right, so who is paying for failed medical devices? First of all, the patients are paying for it, not just in terms of their co-pays and their deductibles and the actual monetary cost, but they are missing work, they are in pain, they are reoperated, they are debilitated, they are disfigured. That is hard to put a number on, but it exists every day. The private insurers are paying, in Medicare, are paying for readmissions, rehospitalizations, reoperations, all of those things. And arguably, you and I are, right? Because we're the taxpayers supporting those endeavors. What about surgeons and what about industry? Where's our role in this? I would also say as a surgeon, when you have a complication from a device that you put in, you're not getting reimbursed for your time or your efforts to take care of that complication either, because that's included in the global charge. When Medicare attempted to put some numbers around this, they took a look to try to understand from claims data, can we identify the cost of a failed or early replacement of a medical device? In order to try to quantify this, they looked at 7 failed cardiac devices, which are approved through a class 3 designation, and they looked at them specifically because these devices are under warranty from companies. What they found over a period of 10 years, ending in December 2014, is that the estimated cost of a failed class 3 device is $1.5 billion for those 7 failed devices. Out of that, beneficiaries of Medicare paid $140 million in copayment and deductible liabilities related to these replacements. So what does this mean? First of all, we can't wrap our arms around what an encounter is for. We don't even know which encounters are linked to a device failure, and that's something that the Office of the Inspector General identified within this report. Second of all, when we don't know what the cost is and we're not able to identify it, it can be that the industry sits by quietly and shifts the pay to the insurers and then also to the patients and the taxpayers like us. So how are they doing with that? Quite well. In 2021, you can see that the top device producers grossed $29.4 billion. There's nothing to require them to reimburse anybody for the costs of these failed devices. And although they may offer a warranty or a free replacement of those devices, hospitals either can request the warranty to be honored and they might get that payment back, but then they can also turn around at the same time and ask the insurers to pay for that without reporting the warranty payment to Medicare. So the hospitals sit quietly in the middle, and in either way, they won't lose. So is there a better alternative? We all want improved rigor to the pre-market process. We all want improved rigor of post-market surveillance. The problem is it's burdensome to the FDA. It's expensive and the scope is astronomical. So I'm going to move along so I don't bog you guys down, but what I'm going to say is, at least in my opinion, the answer might be registries. Registries can embed trials for substantially less cost than a prospective randomized control trial would be. We can all drive our quality improvement initiatives around registries, so we can make changes to the care of our patients and then follow those changes and see how the patients do. We can trial new devices with minimal financial burden. We can provide data to apply for indications for use, but most importantly, we can provide post-market surveillance of devices so we can identify early signals, like in this example, where the ACH-QC was utilized to identify a signal from a device that was failing or not performing at its expected level. We were able to drive a change in the indication for use for that device, and that might be one way forward. As surgeons, we all have some part to play in this, and if you don't think so, you're kidding yourself. Altruism should be a part of it. We should take responsibility for our patient welfare. But we should also remember that our trade is inherently conflicted. We profit off of the suffering of others, and so we have to be responsible and identify and understand these processes when we're putting a permanent device into a patient. We should contribute to registries. It's minimally burdensome for us. It takes a little bit of time, but we have the ability to accrue vast amounts of pragmatic data quickly and can offset some of the burden by sharing it with the federal government and industry players. So in conclusion, I would just say device regulation is currently completely inadequate. Stakeholders have little regard for the cost of care. We need to do our part to contribute. Our current situation is clearly unsustainable, and registries are, in my opinion at least, the most reasonable way forward. So I'll just end with a question. Are you doing your part? Thank you.